Orthodoxy in that sense just kind of remains punk rock. But starting with trauma or something like that actually is, it's kind of funny actually.
That's really where we come from, is like no bullshit, no facade, no playing games. Let's just get to the serious stuff.
If you've been a part of subculture punk, there's a paradox there. There's a lot of humor and there's a lot of kind of self-deprecating type of comedy that comes out of that seriousness, but trying to stick to this punk narrative. It's just trying to preserve a narrative, God's revelation to man. Unfortunately, there were deviations. Orthodoxy in that sense just kind of remains punk rock. I think that Orthodoxy, as it's kind of having its moment, you could maybe even say it's sort of nirvana moment, like when Nevermind broke. People now are finding about music that has existed for a long time. There were a whole scene in bands and great music, an ideology, a worldview, a lifestyle, obviously a fashion, but then it became the most popular thing in the world. It was in the malls. Orthodoxy is kind of at that moment right now where Smells Like Teen Spirit was just put on MTV. Orthodoxy in America was an unknown form of Christianity. It's kind of existed as a subculture.
Punk, metal, hardcore culture.
Why are they drawn to Orthodoxy? I think it kind of makes perfect sense if you understand punk culture.
Defines kind of the punk rock ethic is authenticity.
Yes. And so the antithesis of that is the poser.
Yes, ethical kind of battle within punk.
Was authenticity versus being fake. Let's just say Orthodoxy is going to follow punk. Then whatever is happening right now, hopefully it will have a lasting effect. What I foresee is a very similar thing that happened to the grunge movement. The very person, Kurt Cobain, who was instrumental in kind of making it happen, he committed suicide a few years later. It lasted 3 years. I see a lot of similarities. Or what potentially could happen is that there's this kind of nevermind moment. It's cool to be Orthodox. In 3 years, it's going to commit suicide.
Good day, my dear friends. Welcome to the Study of Stuff podcast. My name is manoelia, and I invite you to get ready to have your mind completely blown. This interview with Orthodox Outcast really, truly blew my mind, and I'm not just saying that. If you tune into SOS Radio, you know how much I adore his music. You know how much I adore his artwork. He's an incredible individual. You're about to find out why it is that I'm so drawn to his art. He's incredible. He speaks in such a poetic way, and he simplifies some subjects and concepts that maybe some of us overcomplicate, let's say. Honestly, I'm not going to say much more than that. Please settle in, get ready. Oh, there we go. Mexico sounds, baby. Mexico sounds. I love Mexico. Anyways, get ready to get your mind blown. This is my interview with Orthodox Outcast. Just telling you guys, be prepared to have your mind blown. Word to Big Bird, Jing Jangs and the Wiggity Wangs, and follow him everywhere. And word to Big Bird. Okay, we are live. With me today, I'm very excited for this conversation. I do say that every time, but that's because I pick really good guests, great guests, and fantastic individuals to talk to. So today with me is Orthodox Outcast, Seraphim. Welcome to the show, my brother. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, this is going to be great.
I know it will. I've been looking forward to this since we've had a couple of conversations, private conversations. I'm a fan. Everyone that tunes into the show or follows me in any regard knows that I'm a fan of Orthodox Outcast. Your Instagram page is fantastic. Then I started to get more and more into your music, past and present. On SOS Radio every week, you're spun, not just because you're my friend and all that stuff, but because you actually put some great music out there. Your Instagram page is always on our feeds. So as we play music, we always have your artwork going, and I always get messages. Who is this guy? What's going on? Rock and Roll Messiah is like every week we play it. Crush, we play it every week. We play some Orthodox Outcast as well. As I ramble, I'll have some of your instrumentals going. So yeah. So for everyone that's asked me, who is this individual? What's he all about? Well, you're going to find out today in this amazing interview that we're going to have. So I just want to set you up. and kind of let you go and do your thing. A lot of the subjects we talked about in our private conversation are probably going to come up, but I definitely want to kind of get you to give us a little bit of the background of, how you came to Orthodoxy. It seems that a big thread in your work is trauma, a little bit of darkness. And I don't mean to touch upon that early in the game, but it does seem to be a big part of what you do. And I love that because it does fit with the whole Orthodox ethos and the reality of it, and as well as your punk background, because I think that's an important subject to talk about. It's something that I've been consistently talking about, the pipeline from subculture to Orthodoxy. So I'm going to let you go. Take this conversation any which way you like, my friend, and the stage is yours.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a great place to start because that's the point of punk, and I think even how we look at Orthodoxy. I think Orthodoxy is bigger than our experience. I don't think we're experiencing it the same way that a cradle Orthodox, especially someone in a different country and culture, But starting with trauma or something like that actually is, it's kind of funny actually, because it's such a serious subject, but that's really where we come from, is like no bullshit.
Yep.
Right. And no facade, no playing games, and let's just get to the serious stuff because we're serious people. If you've been a part of subculture, punk, and those type of things, there's a paradox there. I think there's a lot of humor and there's a lot of kind of self-deprecating type of comedy, right? Yeah. But it comes out of that seriousness and probably even taking ourselves too seriously, but that's just kind of our way. And so that's how our approach to Orthodoxy tends to kind of follow suit. And let's hope so, because I think that as Orthodoxy becomes more mainstream, then it's going to have that same tension that punk rock had, or in the 90s of the grunge movement. When you position yourself, well, it's not even like you position yourself, it's that you are kind of cut out from the status quo, from the mainstream, from pop culture. Either you're positioned or you position yourself against it. You're a subculture, you're a counterculture.
Yep.
And, it kind of just is what it is. I think it can produce some really good things. But there's obviously some blind spots and some hypocrisies in that, which, we can get into it. But I think that Orthodoxy, as it's kind of having its moment, you could maybe even say it's sort of nirvana moment. It's never mind moment of entering into the mainstream. And so it's going to be interesting, to say the least, to see what happens from here. But that's kind of how I frame it. It's what I was kind of thinking about this morning, is that Orthodoxy in America was an unknown kind of not branch theory, but, a form of Christianity. Of religion, and it's kind of existed as a subculture. And I think, the answer to the question, what is that pipeline? Why are there so many sort of punk, metal, hardcore, alternative, whatever word you want to put it, those are different kind of subcultures within the subculture. Why are they drawn to Orthodoxy? Apart from a genuine, move of the Holy Spirit, a conversion in their heart to Christ, a life-changing experience, that's ultimately what's most important. But why Orthodoxy? Why didn't they become Baptist? Why didn't they become Pentecostal or Roman Catholic, Anglican, or anything else? And granted, a lot of those people have. But I think what is unique about this narrative, is that I think it kind of makes perfect sense if you understand punk or subculture. And I kind of say that, maybe as a neutral stance, but I would maybe kind of put that not as a critique as much as sort of maybe a warning of what could be on the horizon. But to answer the question, directly, I think these people are drawn to Orthodoxy because it is countercultural.
Yeah. Yes.
It is part of the subculture right now.
Yeah, I totally agree. Sorry, keep going.
But what the question, though, I mean, we could kind of stay there for a while and kind of celebrate the moment, which is fine.
Yeah.
But, I'm 53. I'm not, 15 or 23 anymore. So there's, I want to avoid the word cynicism, but
Yeah.
we're realist, But I don't know. I'm a little bit cautious, maybe even pessimistic about what the future will hold. And I think that's going to be a whole new experience for the Orthodox Church and for the people who have converted. But right now, to me, it's sort of like when Nevermind broke. People now are finding about music that has existed for a long time, and that there were whole scenes and bands and great music, and kind of an ideology, a worldview, and a lifestyle, obviously a fashion, a way to kind of live your life that was attached to the music, right? And but then it became the most popular thing in the world. It was in the malls, and every single person, was wearing torn jeans and flannels and things like that. I think Orthodoxy is kind of at that moment right now where Smells Like Teen Spirit was just put on MTV. And it was groundbreaking because at that time it was primarily, it was pop, but what was big was like hair metal. And overnight, so-called alternative or grunge music became the most popular music in the world. That defined the culture, that defined radio stations and what was played and what people listened to and what was the mark of what was cool now. Even a lot of the metal bands, they cut their hair and they tried to kind of, grungify, I guess, their image and things like that.
I remember that. Yeah.
And, for Gen X, in one sense, that was kind of our golden age because there was a moment that it was great.
Yep.
Because, what defined us was just being perpetually unhappy with what was on the radio and what was on MTV, right? And what was popular and what was at the mall and what stores were there and what closed, right? So you went to thrift stores and army surplus stores and things like that. And you had to work and kind of dig to find music. And I think most people, they always had that one particular friend, right? For some reason, they always found the cool band. And then kind of just would spread kind of word of mouth. And it was a very special time. But there was a certain frustration in that. And trying to correlate it like to Orthodoxy is, that's where Orthodoxy has pretty much existed until very recently. Yeah. Maybe, I think probably like 2020, COVID's probably a marker for that. And so there's just this turning point, like I said, like Nevermind being on MTV. But what I was saying is there was this golden age where there was excitement and it felt like we won, right? Finally, like the good music, the cool music is on the radio. See, told you, not there actually was a lot of cool music on the radio and on MTV, but there are so many bands and that were completely unknown in types of music and things like that. Anyway, so there was this great moment that we felt like we won, and I remember that time, vividly still, like it was yesterday.
Yeah, me too.
And so it was just an interesting time. Granted, it rightfully questioned our principles, our kind of punk rock ethic, this idea of not being cool, of not being popular. Well, now we are considered cool, we are popular, and some people struggle with that, right? And so how do you kind of uphold that you are still cool that you are still an individual, that you still are unique, that you're a nonconformist, right? When everyone else dresses like you and listens to the same music. Now what do you do to differentiate yourself from
Yep.
others?
Yeah, you make a lot of great points there, and you really summed it up well. I'm a little bit younger, but I clearly remember those days vividly and fondly. I'm 46, so I was in grade 9 or something when Nevermind broke. But so to kind of tie together what you're saying, I grew up Orthodox, cradle Orthodox. So for me, seeing this this build up to the popularization of Orthodoxy online and all that, with all these new characters, and I mean that in a positive way, it's kind of unusual. It was unusual when I first saw a lot of people kind of converting, like around 2014 or so. So comparing it to Nevermind is actually a really good comparison, and I would say like it would be like Nevermind. The Orthodox equivalent would be Death to the World. It seems that's like the Nevermind album. That's Nirvana. The Nirvana album was like the equivalent would be the Death to the World zine and ecosystem there. And I know what you mean by the popularization of Orthodoxy and how it kind of resembles very much that early grunge movement, where at one point it seemed like we were winning and you had all these bands that we grew up with, and then all of a sudden the mainstream started listening to the Pixies or whatever. I remember the moment someone asked me if I knew who the Pixies were. I'm like, yeah, how do you know who the Pixies are?
Yeah,
It was like that moment where the mainstream pop guy approached me and started telling me about the Pixies. And I remember that like jarring moment where I was like, you don't know anything what you're talking about. Like I wanted to like jump in there and say that. So I like that you compared Orthodoxy and the popularization of it to that early moment. And I think you're correct that is where we're at. And then going back to the history of alternative music in that time, how do you see the future of Orthodoxy going? Like, so how do I pose this question? So if you had gone back into the early 90s and it was just that moment where Nirvana was going to break everything and everything was going to change musically, right. And now we're at that moment in Orthodoxy, how do you see the future of Orthodoxy by comparing it to the grunge movie? Like, are we going to see another Bush kind of pop up out of nowhere? You know what I'm saying?
Oh yeah.
Creed. How do we go from here?
I'll be honest with you. So
please.
I mean, I think we already have Bush. We already have all those bands.
Yeah.
That, to me, we are in that phase. We're in the, Nevermind kind of broke it open. I mean, it's interesting. You mentioned Death to the World. Depends on kind of what era. If it's the Father John Valadez era or the Justin Marlowe era. To me, it's sort of like the original Death to the World would be like Nirvana Bleach, the album that no one knew existed, who jumped on the bandwagon, right? So I think, in Orthodoxy, Nirvana's Nevermind has already happened. Mm-hmm. People are jumping on the bandwagon. That doesn't mean it can't be genuine.
Mm-hmm. True.
I mean, there could be a lot of people who just didn't know about this kind of music, and they're still listening to that type of music today, and so many bands or artists that are brand new in the last 10 years, I find countless artists, and they sound exactly like the music that was made, in the 80s and the 90s underground.
Absolutely.
So definitely the influence and the lasting effect of what happened in the so-called grunge movement has never died. So maybe that would be the most positive thing I could say before my negative thing is that we're at 2024, and if you look at fashion and you look at music, you look at the approach to how artists position and kind of market themselves, brand themselves on social media, mm-hmm. It has this sort of hint of "I'm not trying," right?
Yep.
And as we talked about, I mean, that's part of kind of if we're honest with ourselves, this idea of, I mean, that was Gen X, that was definitely like the slacker kind of form of Gen X is, I'm not trying, I don't care. I may have driven to 25 thrift stores to find that particular brown cardigan to prove that I'm not trying, that I don't care. But the cardinal sin, the unforgivable sin, was to get caught trying not to try. It's like getting caught pretending that you don't care, and that type of thing. Because the ultimate kind of virtue that defines kind of the punk rock ethic is authenticity.
Yes.
And so the antithesis of that is the poser.
Yes.
Right. And so that's kind of the ethical kind of battle within punk, was authenticity versus being fake.
Very true.
There's a spectrum in there.
Very true.
But if you really care about those principles, and there are people within the scene, Ian Mackay and Henry Rollins and those type of people actually, are still thinking about those type of things. You eventually have to look at yourself and see where you are the hypocrite, where you are fake, right? And I think those are the best punks, if you just kind of put it all into that word. I mean, ultimately, punk is not punk. Punk is being true to yourself, being true to your God, if that's part of your worldview. It's just being true no matter what other people think, right? It's dressing how you want to dress. You make the music you want to make. You think how you want to think. You say whatever you want to say. That's what punk is.
Mm-hmm.
But part of that process is looking at yourself and saying, am I a hypocrite? I may say this is what I think and believe, but maybe this is just what my friends, told me to think, or maybe my peer group, says this. And so, that's where punk can be a good thing. So with orthodoxy, if you compare it to kind of punk and how it entered the mainstream, or the first time really, definitely in the West and then throughout the world, was through the so-called grunge movement of the early 90s. So the positive thing I would say is that I feel like it has somewhat prevailed, and it's kind of left its impact upon culture and music, and just kind of the overall collective sort of consciousness of the culture. So let's just say orthodoxy is going to follow punk. Then,
Yep, I could see that.
if that's true, then whatever is happening right now, hopefully it will have a lasting effect for decades and however long, that we're still around. What I, foresee is a very similar thing that happened to the grunge movement, I mean, the very person, Kurt Cobain, who was instrumental, in kind of making it happen. I mean, he committed suicide a few years later.
Mm-hmm.
And it lasted 3 years.
Yep.
That's how long it happened. 3 years of a triumph.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm not trying to predict. I mean, but I see a lot of similarities. And so let's just use that as somewhat as a framework, because I think that's kind of where you're going. If you could go back in time, you kind of left that kind of question left, even unasked. That might be a good place to go after I kind of complete this thought. Anyways, just to be clear, what potentially could happen is that there's this kind of never mind moment. It's cool to be Orthodox.
Yep.
In 3 years, it's going to commit suicide. That's what's going to happen. And with that, suicide were conspiracy theories of murder and this or that, right? And still exist to this day.
Mm-hmm.
And it was tragic. I mean, it's obviously what's most important is that an actual person, died on that day. But in the sense of it, Kurt's impact in the movement, especially for people who really, thought about these things, it was scary because it showed us or at least it called us to ask that question: is this where it leads us? We finally won. We finally kind of triumphed over the mainstream and made so-called, what we would say, we made cool music, cool, but now we're conflicted because it's like mainstream cool, but it was cool because it wasn't cool, that whole thing. But we still were like, all right, I mean, bands are getting giant record deals on their own terms for the most part, doing whatever they want on stage, refusing to kind of be a rock star and this or that. And, even if they had big advances or maybe were making a lot of money, they still dressed like they did when they were living off of, pizza delivery money. Right.
Yep.
So then you fast forward to 1994 and then Kurt's gone. And it was just a scary, dark moment. Like, what happened?
It was. I remember it clearly.
But if you follow that, a lot of it because the albums were already kind of recorded and waiting to be released. But I mean, 1995 was such a great year, for albums. And it wasn't like, the music died in 1994. But the sense of this exhilaration that we won and that we're winning and that we're going to continue to win and we're going to win forever was over.
Yep.
And there was just this sense of it kind of continued. And we just the thought, I mean, just as sort of like, just kind of like as a generation, I guess you could say, we just didn't know what to do. So we just kind of kept doing what we were doing. We made music, still kind of held on to things, but it just felt different. There's just this dark cloud over things. I think one of the responses, and that's just kind of what I project upon a person like Dave Grohl, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, only that's what he thinks, not me. But what it seems that he made a decision, and I think it's one of the responses, is that people decided that's not going to be me. I'm not going to end up dead. And I don't know, what that's going to take, but I'm going to, somewhat think twice about this kind of reckless rebellion, you could say.
Mm-hmm.
And this idea of kind of getting too excited, if we just kind of speak in simple terms, just taking it for granted. That's what happens to everyone. They become successful, especially celebrities, I mean, there's so many stories, whether it be athletes or whatever, they make it and they make millions and millions of dollars, but a lot of them, their career doesn't sustain that type of income, and their lifestyle, doesn't match their income, and they end up, in bankruptcy, poverty, or destitution, or just their life falls apart. And so, but in that moment, you feel like this is going to last forever, is my point. And so, and then the 90s just led to the new millennium, and then that kind of enters into a whole new kind of conversation. I mean, with every turn like that, like a century and definitely a millennium, there's always this sort of kind of sense that maybe this will be a new era, right? A new age. And that sort of becomes a different conversation. So, like I said, if it's true, it may not be, but let's just say it is true. That's where I think we're at with Orthodoxy. We're still in Nevermind, the malls are still, getting caught up, with stocking torn jeans and flannels and stuff like that. And people are going to be jumping on the bandwagon, this or that. And some people will be like, I'm so happy you're here. Other people are like, what are you doing? You're just a bandwagoner, and all that kind of stuff, right?
Yep.
Or then questioning everyone's orthodoxy. And you see that from like people who've converted in the 80s or the 90s. This is kind of the new trend, is, condemning online orthodoxy, coining even that stupid phrase, and trying to play kind of, I don't know, critic or prophet or whatever. And it really just kind of seems like it's just, a human response to, I was there before you, right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I've done my best to avoid that.
You like Nirvana and you like the Pixies and the Sex Pistols. I'm excited that you found Orthodoxy. I don't care why you did, but you're here.
Yes.
Because ultimately what matters is what you do from here.
I think that's the major, because you made a lot of great comparisons. Even the comment that you made about whether or not Cobain committed suicide or if it was like some sort of conspiratorial thing, it doesn't matter. The point is that someone died that day, and I think that's a really poignant way of seeing it and viewing it. And also like going back to the '90s stuff and then moving towards online orthodoxy, which is exactly where I wanted to go. And you kind of started veering in that direction, which is great. Is looking at that time period, so then you also had like the punk stuff, like the punk stuff started to bubble up again, like Rancid and those kinds of bands started to percolate. And I see a character like, or an individual like Justin Marler, who again is pivotal in this Death to the World conversation. It seems like he's kind of pulled back so that he doesn't make himself some sort of iconic individual out there. I don't know if he did that consciously or that's just part of his style, but he easily could have become that kind of a character, like a Kurt Cobain. Not to make that comparison, but there is that comparison to be made. And it seems like he's kind of pulled back a little bit, which I totally understand, because a lot of this stuff can go to your head. And I think the governing difference, if you're taking Orthodoxy serious, and I'm new to it, even though I grew up in it, I view myself as new to it. It's been a humbling experience, and I'm trying to like learn a lot from a lot of other individuals like yourself who converted. And there was at first my ego popping in what you just described. Like, I knew about the Pixies before you did. To me, there was like, what are you talking about? I grew up with this. And then I had to like step back from that. And I had to like kill that part of me because that's just not going to help. So you bring up online orthodoxy, and I think that's a great segue into it, viewing like these characters from the 90s, these bands. The one governing principle they didn't have is Christ. And it seems that if you're taking orthodoxy seriously and you're doing it for the right reasons, and you're not just doing it to wear like a little pin on your jacket, but you actually believe, I mean, if you got into it for that reason, like if you got into orthodoxy because of that, that's great. But if it led you properly to Christ, at least the way I'm seeing it now, well, that's okay. That's a great entryway. But what governs your view on it or how you participate in it is how much you actually believe in Christ, and how much that reflects in what you're putting out there in terms of content, because we are artists, we're online, and there's this online orthodoxy, and there are pros and cons to it. Mm-hmm. So instead of me just rambling, how do you see the online orthodoxy? I don't want to call it necessarily a movement, but there is a sort of movement that does resemble a lot of the things you just mentioned. How do you see that? What are the pros and cons to it all? Like, because you got into it early on, like very early on, so you've seen it kind of turn and gestate into this thing. So how do you see the future of online orthodoxy? What are the pros and cons, or do you have any like comments on the subject?
Yeah, I think all the criticisms are fair. It's not about necessarily are they valid points. It's taking it all in and trying to gather all the information and just really asking a bigger question is, what is the best response? Mm. Not just picking apart certain things. It's kind of, most of the kind of critiques are obvious, mm-hmm. but they're also true of anything else. So-called online orthodoxy is not really a unique thing. But I think my main point I would kind of emphasize is that whether you like it or not, you're not going to stop it. You're not going to change it. You're not going to censor it. Mm-hmm. And that's how, I think it should be sort of approached, especially, on a, ecclesiastical level, with the bishops and their, let's say, pastoral approach. And I think, ironically, Orthodoxy claims to not be legalistic and rationalistic, but it is just as much as any other form of Christianity. Yep. And one of the examples of that is they'll say, well, why don't the bishops write a letter? Which is a very Roman Catholic kind of papal approach, a top-down, like, well, they're just going to issue a document and then everyone's going to fall into line. That's really going to do it. The OCA has a document on guidelines, I think, at least for clergy online. I don't know if hardly anyone knows it exists. But even if it does, I mean, are they going to read that and change their lives around it? Probably not. And what if there are people who are like, well, I don't care. I'm still gonna do it anyway. And I think it's similar to what happened, in the music industry. Definitely, when you did enter into the 2000s, with Napster, that revolution.
Yes. Yes.
The old industry was over.
Yep.
And but there's other movements even before that, and even the trends of kind of like grunge taking over hair metal and this or that. I mean, once you realize that you can't contain or stop a movement, you just have to choose a strategy.
Yes. Yep.
And that's what I think it has to be with online orthodoxy. There can be multiple strategies.
Yep.
I think the most productive would be just to, whether you like it or not, to admit that this is not going to go away. And no one's going to be able to stop it. And if you try to stop it, if you try to censor people, if you try to do that, it only creates a bigger problem. And there have been efforts, and I won't name names, but most of us know, who it is. Yeah. Like publicly and things that were kind of released or leaked or this or that. It's not going to work, because a lot of times, and in that case, it just showed that those people were clueless. Mm-hmm. They don't really know how this works. And so it's just really an embarrassing kind of failed moment to think that you're just going to jump in and just censor people because you don't like their content. And to be, the better pastoral approach, like I said, even if there are serious problems, I'm not saying there aren't, but I'm saying is I don't think the only thing you can do is to accept that it's happened and then try to understand the movement, try to get to know the actual people, and try to use the internet, social media, and even some of these particular people for good.
Yep.
Why not, if you're a bishop or a priest and you've got particular people, especially if they're in your area or this or that, or people in your parish who are listening to these people that are threatening to your authority, which is a valid point, is maybe try to reach out and see if, just simply put, maybe we could work together. You've got a big audience, and you know how to create compelling content. Consider this. Maybe it's kind of when people, go on different channels that they don't necessarily agree. You've got Orthodox people going on Protestant or Catholic channels and this or that, and they have a friendly discussion, and both parties kind of win. They may break off and do their kind of follow-up and show how they, were more correct, or they own the other person, or this or that. But anyway, I think with online orthodoxy, that's what I would say is the approach. Is just accept, whether you like it or not, it's not going to go away, and to try to use all those things for good. And trying to push against it only creates a pushback.
I agree, and well put. And you seeing it in that way, and also I've heard you in the past discuss how a combative approach can only push people away, but having open dialogue and conversation and viewing it from the positive perspective, like let's say you're talking to a Protestant and they may have good intent in why they believe what they believe, and they may not even be aware of a lot of the subjects that we know about as Orthodox, and kind of attacking them off the bat kind of pushes them away, and it kind of defeats the purpose of even having that open dialogue. And I think that that's kind of lacking sometimes on the online Orthodox space. Although I do understand. Sorry, just give me a second here to kind of get this out, because I was thinking about this a lot all day in the last couple of weeks, because I'm trying to put content out, but I'm just trying to be careful on how I do it. So actually, I'm going to pose this as a question and almost like counsel as well, and get your advice on it. So basically, what I'm trying to avoid is giving the perspective or perception that I know, because I don't know. I'm just trying to learn along the way. But along the way, there's a lot of individuals online that I appreciate what they're doing, and I understand. Like apologetics is a major part of early Christianity, and it was what the church fathers were doing. So that is something that I am seeing online. But what I'm also seeing is forgive me if I word this incorrectly, more of a Protestant approach to how they're, or a Western scholastic approach on how they're presenting their apologetics. It's almost as if they're kind of forgetting the Eastern approach, which does have an element of a combative element to it, but there's also a softer element to it. It's a hot, like, you know what I'm saying? Like strict, but at the same time, it's a little bit more humble. And I'm seeing a lot of like quote mining, a lot of scholastic approach to the debating out there. And I do think that there is a need for that, to kind of bring it back to like the grunge thing, because this online orthodoxy is presenting orthodoxy to an audience that's never heard of orthodoxy before, and most of them do have a Protestant or Roman Catholic approach to how they see things. So it's not completely Eastern, so it's kind of coming into the Western fold. So it's a necessity. So I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but I'm just trying to understand it from like I said earlier, I grew up Greek Orthodox, so my introduction to it was a little bit different. And the approach that my grandfather and his generation had was very different. So now how I'm seeing it being presented is a completely different view for me. It's far more scholastic than I ever remembered it. I remembered it more being about the experience. I remembered it more about being about the tradition and the practices. Not that necessarily it isn't in the West, but there is that Protestant approach. And I've heard you talking about this in the past, and it really got me thinking. And you positioned it in a very modest way. It was kind of centered. Your approach was in the center. It wasn't too far on one side or the other. So can I, if I made any sense, can I get you to ramble off on that? Because you really put it well.
Well, I think, obviously, love, fulfills all the commandments, and it encompasses all the virtues. So whatever we do, obviously we have to do it in love, in Christian love, like true love. We have to know what love is. But love has different expressions, and there is a place. I think the word would be polemical, you could be very meek in your apologetics, but polemical is, it is intentionally, even consciously, kind of direct and hard, and even provocative and blunt, however, and it appears to be in a very sensitive kind of mindset, as being mean and not charitable. And I don't think that's true. I think there is a place for a polemical approach. It should be motivated by love and not by ego, and not about hurting the other person and, trying to prove that it's not about, that's what an argument is. You are trying to prove you're right and the other person is wrong, right? So why is it that's not wrong? But if you're trying to prove that you're smarter or a better person than them, then you have failed in love. True. That's the difference. It's interesting where you started, because you asked for my response. I would say I would think about your punk rock, not just your like roots, but who you are. It's kind of a common criticism. Because it's necessary in the sense of are we turning people off to orthodoxy with our approach? Like, okay, well, that's a generic question, but you were kind of saying by being too direct or too combative, this or that. Well, that's exactly what punk is. Punk does not ease into it. Right. That's what was attractive to it, is that it was visceral. It was, like I said, it was a no bullshit type of thing.
Yep.
It was harsh. It showed no mercy. That's what drew us to it. Like, okay, finally, they're not fake. Like I said, you get into it, then you have to kind of scrutinize, the depth of it. But initially, because that's what we're talking about, your first impression. So think about that. That's what I would maybe kind of challenge you. And I would say maybe try to put those two back together. Don't, maybe you're thinking, well, it just seemed like maybe it would be wrong, with Orthodoxy to be punk about it. And I'm like, why? Because look at what punk does. Like I said, you have that confrontation with someone who's being, extremely rash and blunt and provocative and offensive about it, and it made you want to be their number one fan, made you want to start a band, made you want to do the same thing, and made you want to follow whatever that is. I want that. Well, that sounds like preaching the gospel to me. Right?
Yep.
So I don't think there's anything wrong with presenting orthodoxy sort of in a punk fashion.
I like that, because I think that's half of my issue. Is I am a confrontational person. I am a person that likes to debate. I am a person that likes to argue, and I have no problem getting in the ring. And I think a lot of times I've been criticized on that overly. And actually, one of the things I appreciated about seeing the online content when I started getting into like reintroduced to orthodoxy was a lot of the apologetic debates, and I have publicly defended a lot of the individuals that are criticized for their debate styles. It did attract me. It was punk to me. It was aggressive to me. It was abrasive. But then I'm trying my best not to overly indulge that, I think. So
Yes.
I'm struggling with the passions.
No,
So,
I understand, and I have my own, version of that struggle. But this is kind of where I've kind of come full circle.
okay.
Is to see that, which is similar to the spiritual life, the purification, illumination, deification. I mean, you're always kind of in that cycle. And so as you kind of come back around, you come full circle, hopefully you've been purified, illumined a little bit, and you become by grace a little bit more like Christ. And so then you can reapproach that subject and hopefully differently, and then you just keep going.
I like
And
that.
so I kind of circle back around and around and around, and I think, well, I don't think it's wrong to be punk about what you believe. In fact, it actually works. If anything,
Yep.
if you look at how politics is discussed, I mean, I don't know if there's hardly anyone who's like measured and diplomatic, right? Or a peacemaker. It's all combative. It's all polemical. And so I actually think in one sense it's the opposite. The dangers of being polemical is not that it turns people off, is that it actually attracts people.
Right. True. Very true.
And then it appeals to those passions.
Yep.
The passions of wanting to be better, feel better than other people. And so you have to have that enemy to kind of measure yourself by. And so, the American progressive is still talking about Trump, because that's their identity. They don't talk about Biden
Yes.
because they don't really identify with Biden.
Right.
They identify by being against Trump.
Right.
The whole identity is not in what they really stand for, it's what they're against.
True.
That's the same thing on conservatives. That's why they always have to kind of demean, that's the thing that's going on now with the new Taylor Swift album and Ben Shapiro and things like that.
Yeah.
So everyone does it. So I would say the danger is not that it turns people off, is that it actually attracts people, but it creates a really toxic community.
Yeah, that's what that's what I'm struggling with, is because I'm being pushed in that direction, because I do have that type of personality. First of all, I don't know enough to get in the ring. That's where I'm at. I'm at the point where I'm trying to learn myself. And I think that's something that a lot of people that are jumping in the apologetics ring, or to look at punk and orthodoxy and compare the two, the people that are doing the pushback, I think some, not all, I'm not referring to the big names, but some other people that are trying to come up in that way, they need to learn a little bit more than before they start talking. I personally think, I think that's something that I'm trying to do, is practice the faith more than know the faith, if that makes any sense. And I think that's, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I think the principle is right.
Okay.
But let's just kind of stick to our narrative of kind of orthodoxy and punk.
Yes.
Is that, and for better and for worse, but let's just kind of stick with it. When you encountered punk for the first time, you didn't just become a fan of that band. You wanted to create your own band.
That's right.
Right?
That's
I
right.
mean, did you have to know how to sing or play an instrument or know how to write a song or play? No. So why should people who find orthodoxy, why do they need to go and learn how to play guitar and know what key they're in? They don't. They can just pick up.
I didn't mean it that way. I meant it more like in terms of practice, like practicing the faith.
Yeah, practicing the faith, and obviously in the long run being credible. I'm saying there are a lot of dangers to people who just start talking who found orthodoxy yesterday.
Yes,
Just like
that's
it's
right.
really difficult to never play guitar and start a band and play a show, in a week. Probably a
Mhm.
really bad show, right?
Mhm.
But it could be meaningful,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, so I'm just trying to kind of stick with the narrative and just kind of take the posture that, okay, this is a movement that's happening. And
Yes.
instead of trying to stop it and critique it, because anyone could do that, it's so obvious.
Hmm.
Why not, let it happen and maybe shape it in such a way that it doesn't end up in a suicide in 3 years? That's what
Yes.
I
Yes. 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 How do we do that, do you think?
say. Well, I mean, it's kind of lame, but I think there's different words for it. I mean, we used to just call it discipleship.
Hmm.
You could call it mentorship.
Hmm.
Um, and if you look at bands, definitely the bands that have lasted, they always talk about other bands that help them.
True. Yes. Good point.
Not just that they kind of were influenced by them, the whole kind of standing on the shoulders of giants, but
Hmm.
had a relationship with them. Like really took them aside and helped them and taught them how to tour and actually maybe, not lose money. Or a big one for Kurt would have been someone to teach him how to handle fame,
Yes. Yes. True.
because I really don't think Kurt had anything to say.
Hmm.
A lot of
Yep.
people who work so hard, they have this kind of, they're put in a position where they don't have a voice. And so they kind of sit around with their friends, kind of talking shit about all the people who have a voice. Okay, then
Yep.
they finally have a voice. Now what? Silence.
Yep.
They don't
Yep.
have anything to say because all they had were a bunch of criticisms.
Exactly. Exactly.
But there have
Exactly.
been voices, in punk, grunge, whatever, who do.
Yep.
People like Billy Corgan,
Hmm.
Henry Rollins, Dave Grohl, some others. They've thought about these things. They've thought about music. They've thought about their worldview, and they've even changed. And they've kind of assimilated, and they've kind of kept going around their own circle, and they're rethinking these type of things. But I think to stick with that is, well, what can maybe prevent this Orthodox suicide that's on the horizon? Is that I think mentorship,
Hmm.
people who have experience, who have been there, done it and gone through the different phases, instead of kind of coming down on them and kind of trying to, kind of squash their enthusiasm and then, call them out and then critique them and this or that and whatever, just to kind of encourage them and try to teach them how to be a real band, to be a real artist,
Yes.
to
That's
be
true.
a real, obviously, and Nirvana, for the record, I mean, we have these videos easily available to us now. I mean, they rehearsed like crazy. That's why
Yep.
they were so tight and why the Nevermind sessions went so well with Butch Vig.
Mhm.
They practiced relentlessly. So if you compare that to Orthodoxy, it's like if you're really living the life in private, you're sticking to your prayer rule, you're fighting with your positions, you're admitting when you fall, that
Yes.
you get back up, you go to confession, you're not skipping church, not in a legalistic religious sense, but in a way that you're fighting for your soul.
Yes.
Like you're fighting for your band, like you're going to change the world, but you're doing all this stuff in private. Then you just need help to how do you do this as a content creator, a public figure, or whatever it is, or even just working in your parish. You need help. You need
Yes.
people to guide them, and I think that's the answer to the thing. And that's what's disappointing is that people who have been Orthodox, I mean, the people who are hardest on converts are former converts. It's really not cradles.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
That's
people
true.
that converted 10, 20, 30 years ago.
That's true.
They went through maybe the same phases, but they kind of lost touch. They forgot what it was like to have that convert zeal and the super
Yes.
prayer, as Father Seraphim says.
Yes.
I think everyone goes through most of those phases, or the honeymoon phase, and you're all excited and everything. You buy all the books and the icons and whatever, and you quit everything that you like. But eventually that fizzles out, and you got to be confronted with being a normal person again, but just someone who is being redeemed gradually by Christ. And you come back to yourself, and I think you have to make peace with, your so-called former self, because that is who you are. It's just that you're not a different person. You're a redeemed person that's in process. And becoming Orthodox is not an identity. Mm-hmm. It's not supposed to be an ideology.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And, but we need help.
Yep.
So it's not helpful to criticize people who've converted and try to pick them apart. I think that's a major mistake. And where that will end, and it literally may end, and there have been cases already, it will end in suicide.
Yeah.
Literal suicide. Because they feel like they've tried it all, and they think Orthodoxy is their last stop. And all they found were people are just criticizing them, for just the typical kind of rookie mistakes for being a first-timer. So I think that's a bigger problem.
Yes.
A bunch of kids starting punk bands, if you want to kind of use as a
yeah.
Why,
It's you make a lot of good points there. That's a lot to take in, and well said. And I think you nailed it with what I was trying to get at is mentorship, learning from the past, and then what do you do after the honeymoon phase has kind of slipped? Do you maintain your prayer rule? Do you get up to pray when you don't feel like it? Do you do these things? And then if you're doing them in your private moments, they'll show up in whatever content you're putting out there, whether it be art, podcast conversation, or this and that. I think that's really what I was getting at. And I like how you put that. That's really great. Kind of sticking with that in Orthodoxy, like how do you view the dark aspects of it? For like I brought up in the beginning when I first introduced you that it seems like there's a dark element to a lot of the art that you put out, and I mean that in a beautiful way. And then how do you juggle beauty, darkness, trauma, and all of this stuff? Because it is very punk rock, it is very Orthodox. That's something that was shown to me when I came back to the faith through Death to the World and all that, is like there is this darkness that I kind of took for granted because just I grew up with it. But I remember when people would come to an Orthodox church for the first time and they'd never been in there, they're like, it feels like I'm going back to the Middle Ages, they would say to me. And I was like, okay, yeah. And then they'd be like, it's kind of dark. And I'm like, what do you mean, like the lights? Or they're like, yeah, it's that. And like the icons, they're sad. They're like, right. And I was like, and it didn't occur to me. And then I was like, oh yeah, I guess so. Because, you look at like a Michelangelo portrait of God, and then, it's very much like ancient Greek Romanesque, Zeus and little angels that look like little boys and pretty and all this stuff. And then you go into so how do you juggle all that? And how does punk rock fit into that? How does trauma and the beauty of darkness, if I could put it that way, how do you kind of reconcile all these things?
Well, I'll say, I want to make this one point.
Yeah.
And it kind of finishes up the previous ones, and it leads, to this. Is that Orthodoxy does, in a sense of its own kind of like self knowledge, its own kind of how it views itself. If you listen to almost all, I think, Orthodox, I mean, even from apologists to priests to even reading books from elders and saints and this or that, a very common methodology is to not really speak of what Orthodoxy is, but how it is different than the West, or how it is different than Catholicism, and is different than Protestantism. And there's not, that's a good methodology in the sense of kind of making distinctions. But if you're going to define yourself purely by differentiating yourself with others, but without a clear explanation of, but what do you actually believe?
Yes.
And I don't think that Orthodoxy has a clear answer on many things. It just says, we don't do that. We're not like that. So in a certain sense, trying to kind of stick with the punk narrative. So if you were kind of raised culturally Orthodox, it's almost like if you were if you grew up in a punk commune or something, but you didn't realize it was a commune. You just thought everyone lived like this.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to imagine because I don't think, there's probably anyone that exists like that, because punk, that's a big part of punk. It's good and it's bad, is that it defines itself by being different than something else. It's countercultural. And that's why when it becomes mainstream culture, it loses its identity, it loses its purpose for existence, because it exists as a counter, as a rebellion. And so it wants to fight this enemy of the mainstream, but when it wins, it loses.
Yes.
And it has to create another battle, and it ends up killing itself. That's my theory.
I like that. Yep.
It doesn't have a purpose anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Purpose was to fight the enemy. Well, you won. Now what? Nothing. That's nihilism. I mean, we talk about it. I mean, that's darkness. You finally won. How come you're not happy about it? Because you didn't think it through. And I think that if you were raised in a punk commune and you thought, well, this is just the way the world is, like, you would just listen to punk music. If you're probably Greek Orthodox, I mean, everyone's Orthodox more or less, right? I mean, there's no rebellion. I mean, you're not contrasting yourself against something that you don't barely even know exists, and you don't understand it. I've not really heard, very few Orthodox apologists, unless they've come from it, really understand Catholicism or Protestantism or those things, the theology. They usually misrepresent Catholicism and Protestantism and then say how Orthodoxy is different, which is sort of a punk problem. You really understand. I mean, that's what's kind of a funny story about the recording of Nevermind, was that when Butch realized that if he mentioned the Beatles, that Kurt would just do anything he said.
Yeah.
But many punks probably didn't listen to the Beatles because they didn't think it was cool. I mean,
true.
Even though they're the greatest band ever and there'll never be another Beatles, Yeah. But that's kind of the point, is like, you're raised in Orthodoxy and it's cultural, everyone's Orthodox. There's nothing kind of to rebel against, except if you're going to rebel against Orthodoxy. But Orthodoxy itself can't be a rebellion when everyone's Orthodox.
Right.
And that's what we just kind of assume because we live in a non-Orthodox culture. I was on another podcast and one of the guys was from Serbia, and he said the same thing. It's like, well, you're either basically Orthodox or you're Muslim, whatever, but it's like this idea of like trying to convert other Christians, they don't exist. Like, it's really a matter of, are you living Orthodoxy or not? It's not about trying to convert people to Orthodoxy. But we sort of have that luxury living here. But the blind spot is to think that's what it means to be Orthodox, be different than other people. That's not what it means to be Orthodox, but that's how many people see it. That's kind of their card. And we're winning right now. We're having our, never mind moment or grunge moment, that we're different. And we're exposing all the bad things that are in the other churches, which exist in the Orthodox Church, all of them. And so it's kind of having this triumphalistic moment. Just to kind of finish that point, I think Orthodoxy or Orthodox Christians, priests, apologists, there's for that. It can't hurt to really kind of maybe, quote unquote, do a little bit more homework and really, especially in this moment, because now the spotlight's on. Now you've got the stage.
Yes.
Okay. You said you had something to say. Don't tell me that Catholicism's wrong and the Pope and this. No, tell me what you believe.
Yep.
That should be the new rule. You can't talk about the opposing views of Christianity. New rule. Can't talk about it. Tell me what Orthodoxy is, and you convince me.
I think there's also, sorry to interrupt you. I think it's also important to note that there is an important job that some of them are doing, like people that are doing the apologetics, because they're helping the people that are being introduced to the subject, but then you have to go further. So it's like when I was showing Father John Valadez the clip of Joe Strummer talking about people and all that stuff. He's like, he's right, but he has to go further. And I think that's an important thing to throw in there. So I do think it's a beautiful thing that the way Orthodoxy, how I grew up with it and how I see it evolving, or whatever you want to call it, the way where it's at now with the West getting included, I think it's a beautiful thing. I think some of the aspects of like this combative debate style, I wasn't trying to criticize it earlier. In fact, I defended it on a panel I had about the online Orthodoxy. I just think that what you just said there is extremely important, is like the practice, like how you go, what do you do after the fact? Like, you know, after like Jordan Peter says, clean your room. Okay, well, what do you do now? You clean your room. Now, what do you do? Like, what do you do with that? Like, you can't just stop there. You know what I'm saying? So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just think that that's an important note that you just made.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, you know, I think there's been a key figure in this, you know, it's Jay Dyer. I mean,
Yes.
I think not instrumentally, but like him solely, but he really has been kind of the person. I mean, in a certain sense, you could say he's the Kurt Cobain.
Yes. I would agree.
And the reason why the apologetic style with him and so many other, Father Deacon Ananias, who went to school with a friend of mine at Thomas Aquinas College, a Catholic, you know, traditional Catholic liberal arts college and this or that. Yeah, it may be new to Orthodoxy. I don't think it's, actually, I think it is what's needed.
I do too.
Orthodoxy is that there does need to be systematic theology.
Yep.
Okay, don't call it scholasticism, so that's a bad thing. If that's a bad thing, then don't use that word.
Yep.
I don't know why systematic theology is now a bad thing. Why to be systematic, to be clear, to be able, and see, that's the benefit that Jay and these other people bring to Orthodoxy, is because they went through Protestantism, they went through Catholicism,
Yes.
and traditional Catholicism in particular, and that is, you know, they're providing kind of a different service, you know, for those who are on the fence with Catholicism or Orthodoxy or this or that. That, I think, is good differentiation. But Jay knows Catholicism.
Yep.
That's fine.
Yep.
He knows what he's talking about.
He does.
In Orthodoxy, I mean, there's so many different forms of Orthodoxy, but my point is, he to me is part of the solution, not the problem.
I agree.
He properly represents Catholicism.
Yep. I agree. And Protestantism as well.
The difference.
Yep.
Right. I'm talking about those who don't know what they're talking about, but think that they do.
Exactly. So to be clear, I wasn't referring to Jay Dyer when I was thinking about scholastic apologetics. It wasn't him I was referring to. In fact, he was a big reason why I started to rethink of how I viewed the faith. He himself and James Perloff were the first two in 2014 that actually got me going, what? Eastern Orthodox? And then you're correct. Jay Dyer is the reason why I started to understand because as a Greek Orthodox kid, I didn't understand what Protestants believed at all. So he taught me about atonement and all that stuff and Catholicism. And I think you're 100% correct. The fact that he took his time even to convert to Orthodoxy, he took, I believe, a 10-year period between the point of being introduced to the faith and then converting to Orthodox. His form of apologetics is more reminiscent, in my opinion, if I dare say, to like the church fathers, where he's combative and debating, but he's using examples. And because someone criticized him in one of my comments, and he says, well, he doesn't talk about prayer. Jay Dyer, he's referring to Jay Dyer. He wasn't talking about prayer, and he doesn't talk about the church fathers. And my response to that person is like, I guess you don't watch his channel, because there's countless videos Jay's put out about the church fathers, and he's been clear that he doesn't give spiritual advice. He says go talk to your church father and to priests about that. Yeah. So I just wanted to comment on that, because I think that style of apologetics is necessary and needed. Yeah,
and it's similar to people who were kind of fanboys of Father Seraphim Rose, right?
Right.
They get one aspect of Father Seraphim, and they kind of project their experience upon Father Seraphim. You know,
yes.
I think we talked about that. You know, Father Seraphim, you know, clearly understood Buddhism and Taoism, and saw the beauty and the truth in it. You know, and Abbot Damascene's, you know, finishing the book with Christ the Eternal Tao. says, it's the highest achievement of man, without Christ is the doubting, Well, anyone who just picks up Father Seraphim Rose and reads Orthodoxy and Religion for the Future and then starts criticizing, the New Age or Buddhism or this or that, who have never not just studied it, but practiced it.
Yes.
They don't know what they're talking about. Father Seraphim, he's taking for granted all the things that are good and true about it. He's just saying it's not enough because Christ is not in it.
Yes.
But I think in this kind of example when Father Seraphim had those converts, I don't know if you remember, and they wanted, I think, to read the fathers or saints, this or that, and he made them read literature, Yeah. Because you've lost your humanity. You don't even have that sensibility in your mind and heart and that love, for just, simple life and the romance of life, kind of classic Dead Poet Society, Robin Williams kind of philosophy.
Yeah.
You got to start there, which is why he defended St. Augustine so much. And his yes, some of the doctrinal issues became problems and where we kind of differentiate. But that doesn't mean that you throw Augustine away, which so many in Orthodoxy did. And that's why Father Seraphim defended St. Augustine so much. And first of all, is because he had the heart of Christ. He had that pain of heart, that loving, that wounded heart, the heart that's, that cries out, which is why even his comment about Nietzsche, right? It's in that, I forget the exact quote, but it's sort of in that kind of hatred of God. It reveals a love.
True.
Yearning, a hunger.
True.
See, and those are the people that Christ delighted in kind of highlighting and even gaining his followers, we read in the Gospels. It's the people that, the religious figures, the holy pious figures, and that, a lot of them followed Christ. And even said, they weren't all bad. Sometimes it's listen to their teaching, don't follow their example. In other cases, follow their example in other things, But the people that it seemed that Christ kind of singled out, where he saw in them their heart. Yeah, they were off in different areas, but he saw the raw material. I could take that and I can turn that into something, right? That's why we shouldn't police, kind of sticking to our kind of narrative, these converts coming in who want to start a band.
Yeah.
And then we just want to critique them and kind of, steal the thunder because I don't know. And I think some people's because of course there's a mixture of good and bad motives. I don't want to turn around and then just have a blanket statement with them. But I think understanding human nature, there's probably a sense of feeling threatened by all these people coming in. Yeah. So anyway, my main point is I just think that within Orthodoxy, I think there needs to be a better apologetic of what it is the Orthodox Church truly teaches. It's and not just kind of play those easy kind of like we're not like Catholics, we're not Protestants, but we don't really give an answer. I think that those days need to be over. So in kind of our narrative, it's like Orthodoxy is going to find itself, kind of in the limelight, in the mainstream, and people are going to want to know, well, what is Orthodoxy? It can't be, we're not like Catholicism. Okay.
How would you answer that question?
What do you mean? What is Orthodoxy?
Yes. How would you answer that?
I would start with, if people know me, it's like there's always a preface to a preface to a preface.
I love it.
In the moment, I don't know what I would say. Hopefully the Holy Spirit would guide me. So at the risk of going too long, I don't know, sometimes the best place to start is at the beginning. So why did God create man is to share in God's divine life. And there's this kind of mysterious, it's almost like a Romeo and Juliet. Like it's a tragedy, but people think it's a romance, but those people, some would say that it is. I don't know, that's kind of like the fall. It's a tragedy, but it was all kind of by, definitely according to the foreknowledge and plan of God. that God would always redeem or marry the harlot, right? And so there is a tragedy of the fall, but it was to position man in such a way that he's helpless, and that a savior is going to come, and this bridegroom's going to marry this bride anyway. That's a beautiful story. That's very romantic, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's really what the Christian story is. God takes his time, depending on when you believe, when the world, came into into existence and man was created, but definitely took some time before God, takes upon the human nature that he created man, which was in the image of Christ. And so Christ, without forfeiting his divinity, becomes fully man in order to, quote unquote, redeem man. But that's where you start seeing the differences. But the redemption is, even without a fall, man, though being sinless, was not perfect. We're still to grow into the likeness of Christ. But because of this romantic tragedy, there's this huge kind of risk. It's danger. I mean, it's a great plot, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And anyway, when God becomes man, and some people might catch the reference, I won't say what it is, but God and Christ reveals man to man himself.
Yep.
So it's in the mirror, it's in the reflection of Christ. When we see Christ, it's not only that he reveals the Father, who God is, we see who we really are, our potential, who we're really meant to be.
Yep.
That's what the incarnation is. That's really what salvation is. That's why we emphasize so much the Annunciation, right?
Yep.
Because at that moment, all right, it's really begun. He's here, right? God and humanity is now united. Redemption has begun. And so it's in that merger, that union, that synergy of God and man, the uncreated, the created, the divine and the human. It's in that, cooperation, that participation, that communion, that man can become like God through grace. That's the Christian message. All Orthodoxy is, in the sense of, and why we even kind of emphasize Orthodoxy as opposed to the Orthodox Church, is because, and Orthodoxy means a lot of different aspects. It could be right belief, it could be right worship, or right prayer, this or that. But it seems like we tend to use it in the sense that it's this real life narrative of what I just described.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And
yep.
Where, I guess, if we kind of stick with it, it's narrative. So there's obviously problems and maybe how I'm presenting it, but trying to stick to this punk narrative.
Mm-hmm.
That what Orthodoxy is, or the Orthodox Church or churches throughout history, because there have been divisions, unfortunately. It's just trying to preserve the narrative, the revelation, God's revelation to man.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, there were deviations. And Orthodoxy, in that sense, just kind of remains punk rock, if you look at it that way. And I don't think it should be so. I mean, there's a time, like I said, to be polemical and combative, especially when you're in a battle. You know what I mean?
Yep.
In that moment, and there's a lot of kind of similarities between punk and hip hop. I mean, it's essentially the same thing. It's kind of like a rap battle is what I was that's kind of coming to mind. There's a time for that. And when you're not in a rap battle, I think you really need to kind of stay in that sense of peacemaking and brotherhood and seeing so much of what we do have in common, and really try to win your brother back and to try to bring unity back. I know humanism is one of the worst words you could ever use in Orthodoxy. So, so since that's such a bad word, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying love, charity, that we are to bring about and preserve the unity of the church, and to preach the gospel, and that could be other Christians or non-Christians. All I'm trying to say is that orthodoxy is sort of punk rock in that sense. Is that it's just try to preserve the authenticity of God's revelation to man. That's the simplest way I could put it. That is what orthodoxy is, and that's what the church is. I don't know if we'll have time to get into the therapeutic and church as hospital, but that's where it leads. But to kind of, I don't know if that's a good answer to your question, but that's how.
That's a perfect answer to my question, and you tied it right with where I was going to ask next, so I don't have to ask it. And how you viewed punk rock fitting in together, and you nailed it. That was great. I'm going to be probably rewinding that a couple of times. There's a lot to take in there. I really like that answer. It was great. How much time do you have? I want to respect your time.
No, I've got time.
Because I did want to go into, because I think it flows perfectly into where I wanted to go to anyways, what you just brought up, the therapeutic nature. So for me, for those that have heard me say it 100 times with every interview I've done on the subject of orthodoxy, for me, an entry point was, yes, death to the world and all that stuff, and like kind of revisiting my roots and kind of looking at everything from a different perspective. But the aha moment, the moment that kind of went, no, you need to look here. In orthodoxy, it was when it was explained to me that it's not a religion, it's not all this other stuff that you think it is. It's a church, it's a hospital, it's a hospice for sick souls, and that's what we are. For me, that was a definite turning point, and I think I've mentioned that in every Orthodox conversation I've had. But I think it's an important key factor, and the therapeutic nature of punk. For me, that was one of the things that attracted to me, because I've been thinking a lot about this, because I've been talking about this a lot, and like what attracted me to punk. It wasn't like I like the early examples of punk where it wasn't about the costume. So you had like Talking Heads were considered punk, and the Ramones were considered punk, but so Iggy Pop was considered punk, but so was the Modern Lovers and all of these artists, and then the Smiths and all that stuff. To me, that's punk. And that they don't look the same, they don't sound the same, but they have the same sort of like truth, the same rawness, the same reality. Like they're trying to get to the essence of something. So then when orthodoxy was presented to me as a hospital, as a hospice, I saw that same sort of thing, that truth, that real, the truth is all that matters. And then yes, truth is a who, not a what, and all of that kind of started to like make it all make sense. But my entry point was the hospital, because that was something that I was looking for in when I veered off into the occult, and why I even got interested in to begin with was the idea and concept of consciousness. That was my entry point into that subject. And really the reason why I was looking at that was because I wanted to have that healing. I wanted to have that therapeutic nature to it. And when I started to practice orthodoxy, I started to see that in something as simple as the Jesus prayer, or just, understanding the passions, trying to understand Unseen Warfare, the book, the great website that Justin Marler put together, and then going through all the principles of like understanding what does it mean? What are these things? What is the passions? What do they mean? So I'm rambling, but I think you understand where I'm heading towards this. How does orthodoxy fit into your therapeutic journey? And clearly, like, that's something that shows up in a lot of your art, and it's one of the reasons why I adore a lot of the art that you put out there. It is therapeutic. Like, I see the struggle, I see all that. So if you want to just go into that direction in any which way you want, your rants are amazing. Don't stop. Just go.
Well, it's often said, it seems like current apologists like to emphasize in orthodoxy, it's not either or, it's both and. Mm-hmm. But for some reason, then they just tend to speak in either ors all the time. Okay, I thought we were both and, but then you just create dialectics all the time. The church is a courtroom. Christ is the judge, and we will be judged, and we will face him, and that's why we should fear death.
Uh-huh.
Where's the hospital? Well, there's a hospital, but there's also a courtroom. They've taken that quote and they've just made it into something more than what it was trying to say. So that's what I'd say. Part of it is kind of weeding through this kind of false view of the therapeutic orthodoxy. It is both and. Okay. The church is a hospital, but it's also a courtroom. I mean, we have canons, we have laws.
True.
And they like to say, well, we don't like to say laws. Like, okay, they're guidelines. Whatever you call it, they're clearly rules. The laws. They're, just because that's a part. You have to have them. You have to have rules.
Yep.
And if you overemphasize the rules, that's what legalism is.
Ah, yes. Good point.
But we don't abandon the rules just because people overemphasize them. And that's the tension that, we all live in. And of course, people who want to somewhat uphold the rules are always get accused of overemphasizing the rules, right? I mean, it's a natural tactic. I think we just have to accept that we just live in that tension. We're all trying to find the narrow royal path, right? So I would say, in the sense of like getting better, is we can't just emphasize the hospital and throw away the courtroom, because it's both.
Good point. Good point. Good point.
Second thing is, the meaning of a hospital now is very different than in before, even 20, 30, 50 years ago, much less, 1800 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if we look at Western medicine, that's not the hospital that St. John Chrysostom is referring to.
Yes.
Come to the church and we will give you pharmaceutical drugs. Is that the church? The church is a hospital that just gives out drugs? Because that's what hospitals do.
Right.
They don't really want to cure people.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to get to the root of their sickness and what's causing the sickness. They want to treat the symptoms, and they want to make money off of it. So it's actually kind of a scary thing to compare the church to a hospital, since we know what a hospital is today.
Good point.
And also, you're going to have massive debt for the bills it's going to cost for all those tests that they played with that you probably didn't need to begin with, and just your drugs. But a lot of people like that because they don't want to change their lifestyle, because it's their lifestyle that's making them sick.
True.
So so it's a kind of a win-win, for them, is we're just avoiding the real issue of what causes people to be sick.
Mm-hmm.
So just give me this drugs and kind of maybe it medicates my symptoms or this or that, or we get a diagnosis, which they have their place. And I kind of wrote about this recently about post-trauma. It is part of, the diagnosis is necessary so you know what you're treating and what you're trying to cure.
Mm-hmm.
The pitfall of sicknesses like that, especially the sickness that we kind of call sin, is when you identify with it. If you identify
Yes.
as a victim of post-trauma,
Yes.
that could be a stop along the way where you actually, okay, that's what it is. Okay, I know, that's me.
Uh-huh.
If you stay there, you'll never be cured because you've identified with the sickness. And it's like I said, there's a place to say, okay, this is alcoholism, or you are an alcoholic, and that's even part of the AA framework, and I don't necessarily even know enough, and I don't want to critique that. It's made such a big impact in so many other people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to give the impression that I'm against anything that helps people. But I will say, I think there's a serious danger in identifying with your sickness. In my framework, I would never tell someone to say, I'm an alcoholic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You're not an alcoholic.
True.
You've maybe become one, but that's not who you are.
True.
And as long as you identify with it, I get that. It's taking ownership, that quit playing games, you have a problem. I get that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not who you are. And so whatever that sin or passion is not who you are. It's just a struggle you have, and maybe very serious, that you maybe need to take it more serious than what you are. So it's fine. There's different frameworks. But ultimately, you have to get to the source of the sickness. And most importantly is you have to identify, how do you contribute to that sickness? Especially with things like post-trauma or abuse or this or that. That's a big part of my framework, is you don't take blame for something that's not your fault. If something bad happened to you, that's not your fault. You didn't deserve that. Now, down the road, you learn to take responsibility that if you did contribute to that in some kind of way, that's a moving, forward towards healing. But that's what the Christian life is. That's what repentance is. It can't just be, blaming it on Adam and Eve and the fall or this, much less anything else. Or all obviously that's a contributing factor, how you were raised and this or that, choices you've made, things that happened to you. All that's part of the equation. But once we get serious about being cured, we have to focus on what we are doing. How are we contributing to our sickness, and how are we contributing or not contributing to our healing? And that is a completely change of thinking, of every aspect of our life. How we think, how we see things, the words we say, how we live our lives, our diet, our rest, exercise, prayer, of course, the sacraments, everything. That's a part of the equation. It's holistic. And so in that sense, yes, the church can be a hospital.
Mm-hmm.
It's supposed to be a hospital, meaning it's supposed to be a place that people can go to and feel and be safe, and not be abused, to be understood, and to have people there who are truly qualified to heal people. I first encountered Orthodoxy 25 years ago. I've rarely had that experience with anyone. It's very rare. And in the sense of our moment here, our, in a grunge moment, there's been a lot of people joining the Orthodox Church. And if the church doesn't truly become more of a hospital and quit saying, it's going to hurt a lot of people.
Yes.
Because a lot of people, and I know a lot of them who have converted, have tried a lot of other things.
Yep.
They're really counting on this to be the last stop.
Yep. Very true.
And I don't think, unfortunately, on the ground in real life, it's not talking about the mystical body of Christ and this or that. I'm talking about the human element. Unfortunately, I do think it falls very short. And if you kind of trace a little bit of the recent history of this kind of therapeutic approach to Christianity, the Catholics and the Protestants have been doing this for decades. For very long. And I don't even... we talk about Metropolitan Orthodox Vlachos, and
yep.
He's kind of, because he has the book, Orthodoxy and Psychotherapy, and several other books, and his influence for Father John Romanides, which I know you want to talk about a little bit. Mm-hmm. And there's others out there, and then and he's done a good job of, even through St. Sophrony, and even looking through patristic sources, and even the Desert Fathers, and he's kind of taken their words and maybe their practice and kind of brought it into a framework, to kind of create a so-called therapeutic orthodoxy, and I don't know if it's his line or Father John Romanides, but orthodoxy is not a religion, right? It's a therapeutic science, that type of, and I agree, as a both and, it is a religion, but it also is a therapeutic science.
Yep.
But where do you experience that? I find it very difficult to encounter. Just saying it doesn't make it true. And that's where I would say, there needs to be some improvement. And because, in Catholicism, this happened definitely around the 1960s, definitely around, which kind of led into Second Vatican Council and afterwards, was this openness of integration, of synthesis, and for better and for worse in many cases. But the positive is that it integrated the best of everything into at least their expression of the Christian faith, and tried to heal people holistically. I think it hit Protestantism around the 1980s. You had some people who are kind of the pioneers in it. And I've yet to really see a movement in Orthodoxy that's really been a popularized kind of expression of integration. It's probably happening, as all movements do. There's kind of a lot of things happening for a while before it kind of, hits, kind of our viewpoint. I can leave it at that. You can respond.
I agree. For the way I'm seeing, even Father John Valdez mentioned, because we talked about the unseen warfare, and it's mentioned in there too that it's a science of the church fathers, something along those lines. It's phrased in that way. For me, where I found, and I can't say I'm healed by any means, but where I found like a better tool, because I've when I got into like the occult, new agey stuff, whatever you want to call it, my whole thing wasn't so much like crystals and blah blah blah. It was a lot more about understanding consciousness, and even my meditation practice that I was trying to was that very point, was to understand what is that thing that's looking back at me when I look in the mirror. You know, I would stand in front of the mirror and I would look inside my pupils, and something would stare back. And what is that? That was always my biggest interest. And to kind of wrap up my point there, unseen warfare and understanding the passions for me, and understanding the difference between vice and a passion, and understanding the three enemies, the world, the flesh, and the devil, and then kind of taking accountability of a lot of the things you just mentioned earlier. That was great. A lot of the ways you put that is accountability is a key component. But also not being accountable for something that isn't your fault. I like that you threw that in there. That's very true, because that's often sometimes that's thrown around and battered around in the new age. Like something that bad that happened to you, it's your fault somehow, like that kind of thing. And the therapeutic nature that I'm seeing and trying to understand is from the perspective of unseen warfare and understanding the passions. And by understanding those, and I'm really not. I'm just beginning to try to even wrap my mind around it, the difference between vice and virtue, understanding that one can combat the other if you know how to like reverse it, and everything's an inversion. For me, that's been helpful in a therapeutic sense. And to kind of tie it together, why I brought up consciousness and my journey through the occult is because that was my interest. My interest was understanding how am I responsible for something that's occurred in my life? You know, they call it about like synchronicity, and in our faith, it's God's providence through synergia, through synergy, and rethinking everything from that perspective has been therapeutic so far for me. Which is like, I may not know what I'm doing, I may not understand what I'm doing, but my intention, I believe, is with God. I intend to get closer to God. That's my intention, and if I make a mistake along the way, either he'll help show me that mistake through God's providence and through whatever I create, as the new age people would say. I don't look at it that way anymore. I look at it more of like asking God's permission. Is this something that you will for me? Is thy will be done? Is this something you want for me? And if so, then let's, I'm going to keep walking in this path, this direction. Does that mean that I should be healed of certain issues I have? Am I ready to be healed? Like for example, let's say I'm in need of a lot of money. Well, I look at God, and I could be wrong, but I look at God as like my father teaching me how to drive a car, like a Lamborghini that goes fast. And like, am I ready, Father? Like, here are the keys. He'll hand them to me when I'm ready, or else I'm going to wrap that car around a pole, right? So when I look at the therapeutic nature of orthodoxy, unseen warfare, and taking accountability, I'm spending a lot of time trying to understand confession, because I'm new to confession, as sad as it is, and repentance. What do those things mean, so that I can clear my noose, as Father John Valdez described in the interview I did with him, like a dirty mirror, the image of God you can't see until you clean the mirror. And then Father Turbo is helping me understand confession and repentance. What do these things mean? And then having conversations with you, this one and the previous one that we had privately, it's helped me kind of look at this therapy from the perspective of someone trying to clear my noose through God's providence and his help through synergy. Sorry, I always have a hard time saying them in English because I just learned them in Greek. That's been helpful for me. I don't know if that makes sense. I don't know if my rant, kind of pulls it all together. But to me, that therapy has been instrumental in helping me try to figure things out. And along the way, things have gotten harder. They haven't gotten easier. And I look at those difficult times as a moment of God saying, like, okay, what are you going to do about it now, dude? Like, are you going to get up? Are you going to keep going? And then every time I get up and keep going and keep trying to figure things out, those hard moments become great moments. I know it sounds cliche, but it really does seem to be helping me because I'm kind of over the honeymoon stage. Like it's not, it's harder. Everything's harder. But when the tree starts to produce fruit, the fruit is far sweeter. It takes a lot more to get that fruit out of the tree than it used to using New Age tactics. But I don't know if I'm making sense. And I apologize for my rant, but that's how I'm starting to understand the therapy of it. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yes, makes perfect sense. 2 points. One is, it's kind of like the phrase, "This is why we can't have nice things." Is that the phrase? We ruin everything.
Yes.
And so when, people who get into mindfulness or Buddhism, especially, in the so-called West or whatever, and even was kind of popularized in that way from a commercial kind of capitalistic point of view, it really just kind of fostered a degree of kind of self-love, or I don't like the word, overusing the term narcissism, but it's the antithesis of what Buddhism actually is, which is to conquer the false self, the persona, and all the false perceptions of what reality is, and try to get to reality itself, and to get beyond persona, beyond even the self, into the true reality. That's what Buddhism is. The fact that you could turn that into something that's about me, and me, I mean, that is ridiculous. I mean, it's
True.
a tragedy.
Yeah.
Like, it's everything about Buddhism is ascetical. It's a complete denial of everything that is unnecessary. Doesn't mean that it has to be like bad. It's just that it's in the way. It's what's contributing to your sickness, and it's not contributing to your health. It's not leading you into reality. It's keeping you from it, right? And it's kind of like, we use the terms kenosis,
Yes.
and theosis.
Yes.
So there has to be a self-emptying, and that's the emphasis in Buddhism. That's why the Western mind misunderstands it and thinks, "Oh, it ends in nothingness." No, it's just a way. It's an apathetic way of kind of saying everything. It's the absence of everything that is not real, and everything that's left over. Nothing is actually everything. It's everything that is real. It's not a killing of oneself or a self-emptying for its own sake. It's to empty oneself of the false self, so the true self can be manifested or reveal itself. But without Christ, it's impossible to achieve that.
That's it. Yeah.
But the framework is right. Just missing something really, really important. Christ.
Yeah.
Now, we believe that God, in its grace, is everywhere present and filling all things. So it's not to say there's complete absence of grace. We don't. But in order to truly cooperate with grace in such a way that we can really be changed, we at the very least could say you're at a severe disadvantage if you're not consciously doing that.
Yes. True.
Yeah, I don't want to limit what God can do, but I also, don't want to deny simple realities, is that without grace, we have no hope. Right?
Absolutely.
And if we see, and even a great Father Seraphim quote is like, if we see how difficult it is to be saved within the Orthodox Church, well, how much harder it must be outside. Yeah.
Yes, true.
So I don't want to give the impression that, anyone can get there through any path. It's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying that God is very loving and generous, and we really just need to see if we've been given the so-called fullness of revelation, the access to the fullness of God's grace, we better take advantage of it. And as I said on another podcast, because there are people who are doing more with less. So for God to determine and judge. But my point here was to say that Orthodoxy, because that's who we're kind of focusing on, is that Orthodoxy cannot be something that we just bring into our identity and our lives in order to feel better about ourselves, to feel better or cooler.
Yep.
there's that. It just becomes, it's the complete opposite of what the whole point is.
Yep.
Because of the residual, fallen nature that lives in us, we have this tendency towards self-love and not true love, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But to combat that kind of false self-love is not self-hatred. And see,
Yes.
and that is where I would say, and I have written about it a little bit, is there is a misunderstanding of the fathers and of their teachings of the elders and the saints, and they're used to hurt people. It's what we call spiritual abuse.
Mm-hmm.
They should be healing people, but they're abusing people because they don't really know how to heal people. That's why it's so important to really understand, what we're talking about and what this, how to heal people. It's a learned skill. It's not, you just don't get that through ordination. You just don't get that through baptism or chrismation.
True.
So that's one of the points I want to make is that for therapeutic orthodoxy, we have to be careful that it doesn't become like popular Buddhism or this or that. And a lot of people went through the New Age and things like that, and law of attraction and all that stuff, is that it just becomes very narcissistic.
Yes.
It has to be ascetical.
Yep.
But that asceticism can't be a self-hatred, because that's just another twisted form of self-love.
True.
And that's why we really need a guide, and why we need the true faith to walk the true path. The other thing is just really understanding that, if you're talking about understanding the vices and the virtues, we use the term more passions,
Mm-hmm.
is we can't look at it in a dualistic way. That's not the truth. God created everything good. It's not that good and evil or these combative forces and this or that. And that would be a false view. There's only good, and evil is a privation of the good. And so our so-called passions or our vices come from desires given to us by God. They're either part of that primordial man, before the fall, and there are differences after that, but that is the man that we are. We can't kid ourselves. We're not going to return to the garden. That's not what redemption is.
Mm-hmm.
There was man before the fall, there's fallen man, and then there's redeemed man, the man who's moving towards the future. It's not a return. I mean, you could speak of it as a return, but there's dangers in that, so it's not incorrect. I know that's used. But if people give the impression like, we need to try to study and figure out how Adam and Eve lived in the garden, and that's how we're supposed to live, I think there's major pitfalls there. It's about moving forward towards our redemption.
Mm.
And we have to understand that these desires we have of the body and the soul, we need to see them as good. But when they lead us beyond the boundaries, the rules, the laws that God has ordained, that's what makes it sinful. It makes it evil.
Good point.
And if you control us, and we don't have control over those desires, that's what makes it evil. That's what makes it a passion. And there are degrees, but that's what makes it bad, right? It's that God-given desire that is good, we're using it not for good, or that desire has power over us, and we're not in control of it.
Yep.
That's what we're talking about, and that's something that has to be clear. Otherwise, we could really get off on the wrong path, thinking that this desire is bad.
Yes.
Desire, it's not bad.
Yeah, it's about ego to tie it all in together. That's a good point that you made there. Even when you're talking about the Buddha's approach and emptying and all that stuff, without Christ to bring us back and ground us, that instinct to make it about yourself, to make it to self-deify, which is very common amongst all of those types of practices. It's almost inevitable to a large degree if you for ego to take over and make it self-deification if you don't have Christ, if you don't have that understanding. And what you just pointed out there, that's a very good point about a lot of the desires and urges. Sex, for example, if it's done correctly in the proper environment, the proper sacramental marriage, it's not an evil, it's not a bad thing. It's when it becomes lustful and all that stuff. So that's a very good point. That's a very, very good point. That's going to make a highlight reel. I like how you put that in there. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just really wanted to like nail that down, because that's a very good point to not get caught up in the fact that what makes it a passion is overindulging a desire, if I could say it that way. If I said that correctly.
Yeah, it's either misusing the desire, or the desire is overpowering. That's what makes it sinful. But the desire itself, the power of that faculty, is given to us by God for good.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And it's to gain control and mastery over our powers, our desires, and order them towards their proper end. Right? That's what makes it good. That's what makes it holy. And that's what we really mean by salvation, theosis, deification, divinization, and there's, kind of some hairs to split, in the sense of, well, like, here's another danger on that topic of kind of misrepresenting the West and then kind of saying, but orthodoxy, they'll say, well, it's not moralism.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, well, it's not legalism, but that doesn't mean it's not legal.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so there are those who think because we're not moralistic that we don't believe in morals. Well, that's crazy. Of course we believe in morals. There's a right and wrong.
Right. But
that's a simple example of just where it's not just silly. I mean, it can be very hurtful to people. They need to understand that we do believe in morals, and there are moral laws, and we're to obey them, and we should grow to understand them. That way we can obey them, not just, out of like, well, that's just what you're supposed to do or you're told, but to grow kind of in those orders of love. At first, it's the fear of punishment. That's what motivates people to do the right thing. They may not want to do it, but they think, well, the punishment would be pretty severe, so I guess I'll do the right thing. The other thing that's a motivator is the next level is people like, well, I'll get a reward for this.
Right.
That's a good motivator.
Right.
That could be more, depending on the person, which is more effective. I think we underestimate the power of fear. I mean, we clearly have seen that recently, and we know what we're talking about.
Absolutely.
So people are definitely motivated by fear. That is it's the lowest form of love and obedience. Mm-hmm. And we rise to say, no, it should be something positive. If I live a healthier life, there are benefits to that. I'll live a fuller life. I'll not just be happier, but I'll be able to be a better person for other people. I could do more with my life, because I'm not sick and bad or whatever it is. And so there are benefits to that. And so that's a key motivator too. And I think that's what you see when people get into things like changing their diet, whether they go vegan or carnivore, or they get into yoga or some form of Buddhism or this or that. I think it is a step in the right direction, because it's not motivated by fear as much as by the reward, that there are benefits by being good.
Good point. Good point.
But ultimately, the highest level is to obey, to love for love itself. Whether you're punished or you're rewarded for it, you do it anyway because you love the very doing of the act. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's the highest order of love, and that's what we're being called to as Christians.
Yep,
and
I love that. Yeah. That's really well put. That's really well put. I think we should tie this up now, but I do want you to obviously plug all your channels and everything you have. But before we do, what are your final thoughts on our conversation, whether it be about punk rock, what that means, orthodoxy, how it all fits together? Just go for it, whatever you got, and then tie it up with plugging anything you have. But before you do that, I just want to thank you so much. This conversation means a lot, and honestly, I learned a lot, and I really welcome having more and more conversations with you on air, privately, and in every which way. Like, I'm a fan. I'm a fan of this conversation, of your art and everything you've said. Yeah. So
Well, yeah, I'll respond in this way. I will try to somewhat tie it up just really briefly, but
please.
even in response to what you said, I'll even consciously be a little vulnerable about it. It's like I really appreciate, your compliments and your support. I've been through a lot in my life, and I'm a very hurt person, and but I don't think that I'm unique in that. I think a lot of people really suffer, and life is really hard for a lot of people, and so I don't take that for granted. I'm very grateful that your kindness and that you like the things that I do, and so I just want to thank you for that. But why I wanted to say that is that other people need to kind of see themselves in that as well. Is that becoming, Orthodox? There's people who have gone through a lot, and they're looking for this to be, like I said, this turning point in their life. I mean, maybe since they have this like sort of last stop kind of thing, but anyway, they're really counting on it to be something. And that is a sense I would definitely affirm the idea of it's a hospital. There's a lot of sick people. And I don't think that's a problem at all. I think the only problem is if the physicians, the doctors, if they're the ones who are not healing people or abusing people, that's, the problem. But in the sense of sick people being in the hospital, absolutely. And that's kind of, I'll kind of tie back to kind of wrapping it up, is that it really doesn't matter why people become Orthodox, even if it's for the wrong reasons. Mm-hmm. They're here, they're in Christ, they're in the church, they're on the path. And I really think we should spend less time trying to critique that, trying to control that. Not just let chaos just kind of take over, but to recognize that that's not the work, is trying to control the movement. Mm-hmm. And people's motives and this or that, and how it's changing the church and this or that, and what kind of orthodoxy are they getting. All those type of things are fair questions, but they need to really kind of move ahead and say they're here, they're in the hospital, they're sick like everyone else. How can we best help them? That's really the answer. And I think part of that is, in the sense of kind of tying it all together, is there's something really great about punk, but it only goes so far. And in the way that orthodoxy is punk, I think that's great. It's even just kind of cool. But on the good sense of that it can sort of be a counterculture, a subculture, this or that, sure, that's a good thing. But as we know, there's shortcomings to that. It only goes so far. And every movement implodes, falls apart, splinters, when it refuses to kind of become self-critical. And that's always the danger of the counterculture and the subculture. It positions itself as the ultimate, ironically, the dogmatic, infallible critic. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. And if orthodoxy does that, which it does sometimes, then that's what's, it doesn't end well. So I think if real life on the ground, everyone, lay people, clergy, monastics included, if we were, keep a true, humble sense of self-criticism of where we failed, where we could get better, just be grateful, not try to control what's happening, and try to become a hospital as a goal, then that, to me, is the answer.
Wow, that's really well put. You have a way with words. I like that. You tied everything in together with that last little blip there. It really did. That was great. Thank you. Please plug all your channels, everything you have coming, because you have a lot. Don't. He's like, I don't know.
I like to do that, but obviously the Orthodox Outcast on Instagram is kind of my main place to post.
Okay. I'll make sure to plug you when I put this out. Don't worry, because you got a lot going on. It's great. It's great work. Well, thank you so very much for joining me. God bless, brother.
Yeah, thank you. Same to you.
bored no more.